This is an ABC podcast.
Today's conversation includes content that might be upsetting. Please take care when listening.
Danijel Malbasa grew up in a country that no longer exists. His family lived on a little farm that sat on the banks of the Danube River in the former European nation of Yugoslavia. But as Daniel got a little older, cracks started to deepen in his corner of the world. And the Malbasa family sat directly on top of one of the many fault lines. His Serbian father had married Daniel's Croatian mother. They had 4 children in this mixed marriage, which meant it would be impossible for the kids to pick a side in the coming wars. Daniel went from having family holidays on a sunny Croatian island to sleeping every night with his shoes on, fully clothed, in case they had to run in the middle of the night. Daniel's father died 2 years into the war, and it was his mother who steered her children to safety. And after 5 long years in a Serbian refugee camp, they arrived in Adelaide. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Richard.
Where was home for you, specifically in the former nation of Yugoslavia, when you were really young?
Yeah, so home was present-day Croatia, but it was really the Dalmatian coast. I was sort of born on the fault lines between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. So in a place called Krajina, which means borderline, and was raised in an ethnically mixed marriage.
So this was a Serbian enclave within the larger Croatian territory, is that right, Daniel?
Yes, that's right. Quite a sizable minority in Croatia. I mean, we were a Serbian minority, but it was a very large minority. I was one of those children that had to learn both the Cyrillic Serbian and the Latin Croatian script because my mom was a Catholic Croat and dad was an Orthodox Serb. So if you came from a mixed marriage, you kind of had these classes where the kids who were in a mixed marriage had to additionally study the Cyrillic script, while the Croatian Catholic kids who were entirely Croatian, both parents, were Croats. They didn't really have to bother with the Cyrillic. So I learned both scripts from a very young age.
Was it like Northern Ireland? Like in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, you couldn't tell who was Catholic and who was Protestant by looking at them, or even by hearing their voices. You had to find out their name or there'd be some other kind of giveaway. Could you tell apart Serbs and Croats just from hearing their voice or looking at them in any way?
You very much so could. Croats spoke with it's a word called jekavica. So, for example, to say down, Serbs would say dole, Croats would say doli. Or beautiful, Serbs would say lepa, Croats would say lipa.
Right. So there's just like this slight accentuation in the words here and there that you
definitely, but also with names as well. You know, like my mom is called Jeka, which is a very Croatian name. The Serbian equivalent is Jelena. So there are those differences.
So you were a little boy living with your family in a Serbian enclave inside breakaway Croatia with a Serbian father and a Croatian mother. How had your parents met and been able to overcome that divide?
So they met in the late 1970s. I mean, this was during the period of Yugoslavia. So Yugoslav life was oppressive, but not repressive. The youth had a lot more freedom to meet and gather, and that was encouraged. And my parents, they were able to socialize and meet, and they met at one of these like music festivals that was organized by their community. Young people would get together and dance the kolo, which is kind of similar to a Greek zorba. And my dad would just make sure that he grabbed my mum's hand wherever she was in the kolo, like in a circle dance, and she would kind of run away from him and he would chase after her, grab her hand again. She would break off, run somewhere else, and he would go and chase after her again. And that's kind of how they met, but it happened really quickly, the way they sort of got engaged. literally a fortnight after that, he went to my mum's parents and just said, I'm really enamored with your daughter and I would like to propose to her and, marry her. And that's how they got together. It was really quite quick.
So they fell in love really quickly and got married. Your Catholic Croatian grandparents didn't have a problem with an Orthodox Serb wanting to marry their daughter?
Yeah, see, my mum's parents did not have any issues with it because they were, communists, I guess. They really had no qualms about that. But my mum's brother did sort of ask my dad, so what saint do you worship? What church do you go to? How do you cross yourself? And my dad was like, well, yeah, I am Orthodox Serb and, I cross myself with 3 fingers and my Slava, which is this like Thanksgiving that Serbs have, is called St. Nicholas on the 19th of December. But my mum's brother was like, well, look, so long as you treat her with decency and respect, it doesn't matter who you are, just as long as you love our daughter and our sister.
Daniel, when you look back in your memory and you see your parents together, how were they with each other?
They really loved each other because they had to overcome quite a lot. There's the ethnicity, one being a Croat, one being a Serb. There's also the religion. But also, you wouldn't think this, but there's actually class even dividing, even in a classless society like Yugoslavia. My mum's family are a lot more wealthier. They had like olive groves and a lot of livestock, a lot of vineyards, whereas my father's family was more humble. So she gave up a lot to move from this quite a wealthy Croat family to go and live in this remote village with my father and his family. I remember like they really loved each other. They never fought. They really got along really well. Yeah, it was definitely a sense of safety and love that I grew up in that embrace of my parents.
Do you remember the peace of those years?
Yes, I do. I definitely remember going to Croatian beaches, having a very ethnically mixed friendship group. It was actually quite a peaceful childhood up to a point. I mean, I grew up in a village with a lot of animals. We played hide and seek around Roman ruins and amphitheaters and these archaeological sites that we had no idea the significance that they had. But it was just quite a, idealistic, quite beautiful sort of childhood. But I do remember, though, that we had kind of 2 histories in Yugoslavia. We had the official history and a private history. The official history was the one told to us by the Communist Party, which was we were all Yugoslavs and they were all equal, that, we should marry each other and love each other through what our leader Tito created, this idea of brotherhood and unity. And so that was the official history. But we also had private histories that was a lot more difficult, and it was something that was spoken of privately and quietly, under the cover of darkness. My Croatian family would say things about the Serbian Chetniks fighting Croats during World War II. My Serbian grandparents would say things like they were occupied by the Ustašas, who were aligned with the Nazis, I guess, during World War II. So there was this really complicated history that just was not spoken of officially, but it was definitely there bubbling under the surface.
So there was a lot of dark muttering under the official history then that was going on. Was it a gradually intensifying darkness, or did it feel like it just suddenly happened overnight?
No, I think it was definitely gradual, because I think you need to condition your people, your citizens, to start to fissure and divide along ethnic lines. It just doesn't happen overnight. It started really quite subtly. You'd order something at a store, in a Croatian store, and, you'd use the Serbian word and you'd get corrected for that. And vice versa as well. A Croatian person might buy something from a Serb store and get corrected. And there was a lot of sort of nationalist art produced around that time. There was a lot of Croatian checkers everywhere that just suddenly appeared in early 90s. hanging from windows and bridges and doors.
Oh, you mean that checkered chessboard sort of image
Yeah.
that it's in the Croatian flag?
That's right, yeah. I mean, because it was associated with the independent Croatian state. There was a Nazi puppet state. They used the checkers, even though that's not where the checkers originated originally, but that's kind of what we associated it with concentration camps, with Nazi occupation. But it was also true, with the Serbs. I mean, they were producing a lot of music and art and posters. They were attacking Croats and linking them back to Nazis, and also not just Croats, but also Bosnian Muslims, sort of aligning them with the Ottomans and the Turks and all these sort of history that was something like 600 years old. All of that started in the early 1990s and gradually built up to what was to happen.
So Croatia left, Yugoslavia, Slovenia left, and others, which left Yugoslavia pretty much as a kind of greater Serbia. So if there's no more Yugoslavia, there's no more Yugoslavs. Where did that leave you and your family, Daniel?
We became stateless. Our country disappeared. And not only were we stateless, but we also became, internally displaced people because we had to leave Croatia after Croats fought the War of Independence against the minority Serbs who were in Croatia. That's what made us as refugees.
How conscious of this were you as a 6-year-old? Were your parents trying to protect you from the dark clouds that were kind of hovering over your country?
They tried to. They sort of tried to appeal back to this idea of being Yugoslavs and, respecting one another in that sort of granular family unit. But it was really difficult to maintain that when you switch on the news. You talk to your next door neighbor and you see this racial fissuring that was sort of happening, this kind of racism that was really starting to happen. It was hard to maintain that even within a family unit. And this is especially so in a civil war kind of context where it's family members versus family members, neighbours versus neighbours.
And then war breaks out. Is the family called upon to pick a side?
Yeah, it was really difficult for us because, as I said, with this ethnically mixed marriage, we really were called up to pick a side. And it depended which side you pick, because it could be a matter of life and death. I mean, it was really difficult for us because what am I supposed to say? Like, which part of me is a Croat, which part of me is a Serb, bottom half, lower half. But it really mattered, especially at, like borders and in the bank, in the school, in the post office. You have to disclose who you are. And it was a real difficulty for us once the war broke out.
Daniel, how old were you when your father died?
About 7 years old, yes.
And how did he die?
He enlisted in the guerrilla army that was the Serbian minority of Croatia. They fought against the Croatian independence, egged on by Slobodan Milosevic from Serbia. He wanted to create, greater Serbia. So my dad joined up with the armed forces and went off to war. I mean, he had no experience of being a soldier. It's very similar to what's happening in Ukraine, just random sort of citizens all of a sudden become soldiers overnight. So he went off and served for about 2 years before he died. One day in the morning, he got up and joined his teammate who was with him at the time that morning, and they set off to inspect the area that they've cleared. And he stepped on a landmine. It ended his life instantly. The guy who was with him says that the death was pretty fast. It sort of severed his body quite quickly, so he didn't suffer. And the next time I saw him was sort of the next day. They literally collected his body into a casket and brought it home. And I just remember coming home from school and walking towards my house and just seeing all these people there, all of our neighbors. And I actually thought my granddad passed away because he was getting on with age. But then the closer I got there, the more, I saw that my mom had fainted, that it was actually quite a lot of family members there. And, I walked in through the door and there was my dad there. He just had this massive hole in the side of his face. And that was just this, massacred body that was stitched together so that he would resemble a human being. And that's kind of the lasting memory I have of him, is just this Frankenstein-like monstrosity there. Doesn't really even look like my father.
Oh, Daniel, did that mean that the moment you became aware he was dead was when his ruined body was brought around in an open casket to your home?
Yes, exactly. And all these years, I said to my mom, why did you make me see that? Like, that's the kind of lasting image I have of him. And she's like, it's war. We're not going to palisade anything or cover it up in sheen and gloss. This is what it is. This is what war does. Here, have a look. This is your father. So that's kind of the lasting memory I have of him.
Was there rage in you, or grief or horror? What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to be sort of perspicacious when you're a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
But, I just distinctly remember my Serbian grandparents turning quite nasty towards us. They just would shut the door on us when we would go and visit them. They just became really antagonistic towards us and towards my mom. And I was sort of thinking, why? How come this can happen overnight, that your own grandparents can become so difficult in sort of not being welcoming of you? And I just distinctly remember there was this pall of hatred that was getting quite visceral.
What sort of things were they saying to your mother?
They would say things like, it's your fault. It's your fault that he's dead. Your people killed him. And they would do that publicly in front of others, neighbors, even the people that brought his body, the soldiers. They would say, it's her responsibility, her people did it, she's at fault. It was just difficult, I guess, to listen to that as a 7-year-old from your own grandparents.
Did any of your neighbours come to your widowed mother's assistance at this time?
Yeah, very much so. They did. Some of the women, they came to my mum's help because they knew that she was this woman who was there by herself, a widow with 4 children under the age of 14, a Croat woman in a Serbian enclave. So the women of the village did come and support my mum, but some of the men, it was a lot more difficult. And I do remember this particular scene where there was one of the local Serbian men who was sharpening his knife, literally his 2 knives, like butchering knives in front of our house. We peek through the curtains and see him, and he's like, there's a Croat woman in here. She needs to come out. I'm going to behead her. So it was a bit of a mix. I think the women sympathized with my mother, but the men were a lot more difficult.
How's your mum doing at this time, given that she'd lost her much-loved husband and she was suddenly a pariah in her own community?
Yeah, so she became a bit of a recluse sort of immediately after the death. She just went into her bedroom, wore black clothes nonstop. There was no music. We had to look after ourselves and run the farm. So she really struggled quite a lot because even her own family, the Croats, they just stopped contacting us. We couldn't reach them. She really was completely alone in this hellhole, I guess.
How did she prepare you to live in a war zone?
So she was actually quite practical in the sense that she would make sure that we sleep fully clothed with our, clothes on, including our shoes, that we went to bed fully dressed. She also put up timber cladding all over the window to stop the shrapnel because we had a lot of shrapnel coming through. We'll get stuck in the timber. She would go and find basements so that we could escape into those and sleep overnight if the bombing or the shelling got really bad. So she was quite a practical mother in that sense, just constantly making sure that she stays one step ahead. She was quite formidable in that way.
People living in a war zone, they stay in this extended situation in their minds where the fight or flight response is always on. You must have constantly been waiting for something to go bang or something, Daniel?
Very much so. I mean, my next door neighbour's house, the roof got blown off and we felt the aftershock. It was very much so very close to home. And I remember, once I was running to the bomb shelter and I fell over and cut the left side of my thigh, like a really deep cut. And my mom had to stop the UN peacekeepers to transfer me to like a war hospital where it was stitched up. And it was done in the most graphic way because they didn't have anesthetic. So they just hacked through my body with like a needle and a thread. And I remember just passing out because it was so painful. And the doctor was just like, look at the Mickey Mouse on your mum's shirt, look at the Mickey Mouse. And I'm like, God, this is torture. So, yeah, I mean, war was very close to home in that way.
So it was your mum, you and your siblings, and who else was with you in this farm?
Well, my dad's parents and my uncle from my dad's side. And we also had, I guess we call them aunties and uncles, but they weren't really related to us. They were just really close neighbours who lived in our village.
Your grandmother was with you on your dad's side, but she was part of the Serbian minority, and your mum was a Croat. Was there hostility there, even though she was staying with you and being cared for by your mother?
Yeah, I mean, there was very much so hostility once the war broke out, and it's just really unfortunate, but that's what civil war does. It poisons the minds, it poisons people's attitude and behaviour towards one another. My grandmother, around this time, she was looking after her sheep, and she got hit by a ram. He absolutely smashed her left thigh and completely broke the bone. She had to have a plate put in there and she just was disabled, couldn't walk at all. And my mom would carry her around from room to room, carrying her around the property, whilst this lady, my grandmother, would just completely be incredibly racist towards my mom, just accuse her of being, a Croat, responsible for my father's death, for the fact that the Croats are attacking us, for this war. She was just really quite nasty. But my mom just felt she needed to help her because that's what family does. That's what you do when you're a daughter-in-law in this Balkan culture.
And where was her husband, your grandfather?
He was there. He was with us, but, he also became quite a changed person after the war happened. I remember one day all of our sheep and goats were with them, with my grandparents, and he went around and picked all of the ones who are ours and just threw them out on the street and said, these animals are Croatian animals and you need to find shelter for themselves. We don't want to deal with them. We don't want to feed them. We don't want to clean after them. We don't want to look after them. You need to find your own solution. As I said, I know, Richard, this is difficult to understand for some people, but that's what war does, especially civil war. It cuts right down to the family unit in the most visceral way.
I can see how your mum would want to uphold simple human decency in looking after her husband's mother despite the abuse and complaints. I wonder also if she could still see something of her husband in her.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there was a bit of that. As I said, these people grew up in post-World War II Yugoslavia where there was a degree of love and respect. And I think, as I said, my mom's family, they were real rusted-on Yugoslavs, and they just could not really play into this sort of racist framing of the conflict like my dad's family could.
So, Daniel, how did your mother arrive at the decision to get out?
I guess we arrived at the decision because we knew that the Croatian army was coming towards our village and that they were ransacking everything in their wake. And so we were literally told, you need to leave, you've got 2 hours. If you stay behind, you might be killed. You probably will be killed. And so she just decided, in that flight at 2 a.m. in the darkness with bullets raining above us, to just get us onto this trailer, neighbor's trailer, and just make a run for it.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Richard Feidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So your mum had made the decision to leave as the Croatian army was getting closer and closer to where you were. How did you get out of your village? Do you remember that night?
Yeah, very much so. I remember we were sleeping again with all of our clothes on and shoes on and everything on. And my mum she just sprung into action, shook us at 2 a.m. and just got us into this back of this trailer attached to a tractor. And pretty much, all of the village just crammed into this trailer, and we just made a run for it and joined an exodus of 300,000 people. It was like an entire country on the road, really, that was heading towards Bosnia.
And what could you take with you, Daniel?
We took nothing really other than a few photos that my mom had in her bag and just some key documents and just the clothes on our back. That's it. Because really, when you're a refugee, the only thing you carry with you is your clothes and your blood, and you run for it.
So what did you have to leave behind then?
We left behind all of our animals. We left behind a lot of the older people that couldn't leave. And one of those people was my grandmother, my dad's mother. And it was really quite a difficult thing to leave her there because we assume that refugees can just spring to their feet and make a run for it, but she was a disabled woman in her 70s. She just could not move. And it was it's not a very edifying moment for our family that we left a matriarch in her bed to die, to be killed. My mom wasn't able to carry her because she literally had me on one arm, she had my twin on the other arm, and two 13 and 14-year-olds at her hip. What was she supposed to do? Put an old lady on top of her back? She just couldn't. And my granddad, he joined an army truck that was escaping. So he just basically got onto that truck and left. And he left her screaming in her bed, wanting to live, wanting to survive, wanting to escape. And, all these years I was given a conflicting story because I thought that she wanted to stay because she was a patriot and she wanted to die in her own bed, in her own soil. But no, she actually wanted to live. It's just that we couldn't take her with us. And I don't understand why my granddad couldn't take her, but people make all sorts of decisions in that situation. I don't know what decision you would make, Richard, or anybody else, but it's a really difficult situation when you're running for your life at 2 a.m. in the pitch black darkness with war raging around you, and you have this family member with you that you just cannot carry.
So when you left your farm, you said it was just 2 o'clock in the morning. You got on this tractor with all these other people, crammed into this trailer, moving along this dark road, this river of people desperate to get out before they got killed. You said you were on your way to Bosnia. Man, talk about out of the frying pan into the fire, Daniel. What happened when you got to Bosnia?
Yeah, so we didn't even know that there was another war happening there. So this was the war between Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Muslims. We were there for about a month, and this was during the month of July in 1995. So I'm not sure if you know, Richard, but there was a genocide there in Srebrenica.
Yes, Srebrenica genocide. It was one of the great war crimes of the era.
Yeah, exactly. 8,000 men and boys were murdered. And I remember we were there at a friend's house just to kind of rest because we were just traveling for about 9 days straight without food or shower or water or any sustenance. And we were actually bombed as well during that period. A lot of people died during the exodus. And when we were in Bosnia, we were there for about a month. But I remember just like there was just shooting, just ka-ka-ka-ka-ka of gunfire, anti-aircraft gunfire nonstop. And a genocide was unfolding around the corner while we were there. But we couldn't really stay there because it was an active war zone and we overstayed our welcome with this family. So we moved on further into Serbia.
And where did you arrive in Serbia?
We arrived in a place called Novi Pazar, a very Islamic part of Serbia, very large Muslim community. So once we got there, they put us in a very large factory that was like a sewing factory. They just got rid of sewing machines and just put down mattresses. And that's how we lived, on the floor on a mattress with 700 other people, like sardines next to one another. One pot cooked everyone's food, one hot plate for everybody, just one toilet, one bathroom for all of these people. And it was really quite difficult for my mom because, again, she tried to apply for a war widow's pension from the Serbian Department of Veterans Affairs. And they said to her, well, your husband fought for the Yugoslav army, not the Serbian army, and Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore, and neither does your pension.
Could you go to school while you were there in Serbia?
Yeah, I went to the local school, and that was it was a very interesting experience. Would get corrected quite often because of the way we spoke, because we were a Serbian minority from Croatia. We spoke very differently to the Serbs of Serbia. It was difficult to study when you're living in a crowded refugee camp without room, without basics. But I was actually a pretty decent student considering everything that I've been to up to that point. I really enjoyed geography, history. We studied Russian as well, epic Serbian poetry. This really long prose about the conflicts in Kosovo between the Ottomans and the Serbs that we had to learn. And I just found that, it was an escape from the misery of refugee camp because I saw people, suicide in front of me, a lot of violence. To escape that milieu and going to the school for 6 or 7 hours was therapeutic.
So at this point, were you technically refugees waiting to be resettled somewhere or not?
At this point, we were not refugees. In our case, we were internally displaced people, IDPs. Oh. There are millions of people who are IDPs. We didn't cross any borders. The border crossed us, really. We were.
That's very blackly funny.
Yeah. Interesting thing about my grandmother, for example, she didn't leave her home, but she changed her nationality 6 times. Such is the porous nature of states and arbitrary way nations are made.
And so what actually became of that grandmother that your mother had been forced to leave behind?
She survived. One of the Croatian soldiers who burst through her door, he actually knew our family. He was a friend of my grandmother's grandson. So my auntie from my dad's side, she married into a Croatian family and they knew each other. And he took my grandmother and took her deep inland into the Croatian territory and handed her to her daughter. And they said, why did you bring this old Serb woman to us when we are fighting them? We don't want her. And this is, her own daughter's family is saying this. So what they did is they handed her to the United Nations peacekeepers and they took her to Macedonia. And one day when we were living in a refugee camp in Serbia, my older brother just picked up a newspaper and on the front page, there was a story there about this kind of a displacement camp for people that the UN had collected and put into this center in Macedonia. And there was a photo there of a whole lot of people. And in the corner of the photo was this old lady that had the sort of same kind of mien of my grandmother, same shawl, and she had arthritis in her hands, and she was sleeping on a bowl of soup. And my brother was like, oh my God, this is our grandmother Sophia, she survived, and said, there was a number there. Just give this number a call if you're missing a family member. And we called them, and that was her. She had survived this incredible journey.
And when you contacted her, did she tell you all to get lost again?
No, actually, she was a little bit more mellow this time. I think she realized that she was already experiencing what she was doing to my mom. But she was experiencing in a verse, when she went to Croatia, they told her, well, you're a Serb, get out. We don't want to help you. Her own family did. So she did kind of mellow out a little bit after she saw that, she was doing the same thing to my mom. But her relationship with my granddad did become a bit more difficult because essentially he left her to die. Yeah.
So, Daniel, how was your mum able to get you all out?
Yes, we were in this place and, she was an internally displaced person. We were also stateless people. She was a widow with 4 children. Serbian government could not offer us protection. So she went to the UNHCR office in Belgrade, which is really an optimal way to process refugees, is to actually go to the office that is mandated to help refugees. So she went there and applied to go to America, because we had a sponsor that was sort of helping us from America. He would occasionally send a couple of $100 here and there. And we thought, we should probably go to America, because at least we'll know one person there. And the person at the UNHCR office said, it's so much better if you went to Australia. They've got a really good welfare system to help you when you first get there, really good housing. You get met at the airport, people show you the way of life. In America, there's none of that. It's a real struggle. And my mum's like, okay, cross out America, put in Australia. Good enough. And my mum had preference because she was deemed to be woman at risk, which is a special visa category within the humanitarian intake. And we got approved to go to Adelaide. But, there was a lot more difficulties to come as well.
Yeah, you've got to get out of Serbia, don't you?
That's right. So this was another war now about to start. This was the Kosovo War of Independence. So, I escaped the Croatian War of Independence in 93. I was in Bosnia during the War of 95. And now there was this war between Serbs of Serbia and this semi-autonomous region called Kosovo. NATO was involved during this period. They made a decision to bomb Serbia to stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanian Kosovars in Kosovo. So this was like a third war, and the airport was shut down. You couldn't leave the country. So we couldn't leave straight away. We had to stay put. During this period, I got a job with my mom at a local sort of dairy farm, just hand milking hand cows, to try and survive because the aid dried up. And so it was really quite difficult for us to finally actually escape Serbia. But eventually the UNHCR got a couple of buses into Belgrade. And again, it was kind of under the cover of darkness that they got us into these buses headed for Hungary, for Budapest. But my mom was actually stopped by Serbian soldiers. And they were like, why are you gifting 3 soldiers to Australia?
You mean you as a potential soldier? Is that what he meant?
Well, we have to do compulsory military service as boys in a couple of years' time. And my mom was like, well, I am taking my sons out of this place. I don't want them to end up like their father, buried in a mass grave in a country that no longer exists. So she really ushered us quickly onto this bus. And we made a hasty escape into Hungary.
And from there you get onto a plane in Budapest and come to Australia. Did you know anything about Australia before you came here, Daniel?
I knew a little bit about, from Blinky Bill, the anthropomorphic koala. That was about it. I mean, in Summer Heights High, we watched that, which was an Aussie
Wow.
show.
So you'd seen that. And how old were you when you stepped off the plane?
Yeah, I was 12 and a half, didn't speak a word of English. We literally had one duffel bag between the four of us, having just spent 9 years in an active war zone. It was difficult.
And who was there to meet you at the airport when you arrived?
Yeah, so we had somebody from the immigration department, this really quite lovely young lady. She met us there and she took us to her car. And this was actually, I think, my first car ride, like a proper car ride. So I couldn't tie the seatbelt. It was really quite embarrassing. I couldn't operate a seatbelt. And yeah, so she took us to this really nice house, public housing, but it was really nicely done up, beautiful beds, fridge full of food. Just distinctly remember the smell of freshly mowed, freshly cut grass. The sky was just so blue and wide, and the sound of birds. Like during the war zone in Yugoslavia, there was just no sound of birds or wildlife at all. So it was really quite beautiful to experience that.
So Daniel, then you, at 12 and a half, had to start going to school and learn English. And I presume you had very little English, and now these days you use words like anthropomorphic. So you obviously did okay in your English lessons. Did you have to start in an ESL class?
Yeah, we much so started with an ESL class with other children of war from Iraq, Somalia, East Timor. It was a very diverse group of children who've had disrupted childhood. I remember one time our teacher asked us to point on the world map where we are from, and you'd have, a kid from Somalia point to Mogadishu and put a little pin next to them. The one from East Timor would pin next to Dili, the one from Iraq next to Baghdad. And then it was my turn. And there was a map without Yugoslavia. So I just waited by the map and just, what do I do? And the teacher's like, I'll help you find it. And we searching for it, and we can't find Yugoslavia. And she just puts a pin next to Sarajevo. And I'm like, but I'm not from there. This is Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's like, good enough. So there was those sort of stories.
So after you finished at the ESL school, you went to standard school in Adelaide and did very well indeed. Now, I am assuming that the reason why you wanted to do a law degree was your interest in the human rights aspect of law, given what you'd been through.
It was partly that, but also it was seeing my older brother who he ended up getting a job at Holden's, and he was bringing home these sort of pamphlets about workers' rights. And I was really quite interested in what that involved to try to keep a factory alive. This was during the time where there were mass redundancies. And I was really interested in the legal side of that. But because I went to, I guess, like a working class school or an area where very few people went to university. In fact, I was one of two people that year to go to uni when we had career advisors in year 11, year 12. They would say there's a really good TAFE course you can do or good training college you can go to. We had organizations like Ingham's Chickens and abattoir businesses coming, and butchers and nursing institutions looking for people to do vocational work. And I remember saying to my career counselor in year 12 that I wanted to go to university. And she was just like, are you sure about that? Because she just could not see me going to university or anybody from this area. She's like, there's a really good trade you can get as a butcher. You can start off butchering sort of like chickens and then move up to pigs. And I'm like, miss, I really like literature. I really like learning. I think I can make it. I'd like to go to uni. And he was just assumed if you come from this area, you will end up on a factory floor. So, dream a little cheaper and name a little lower kind of thing. But I did pretty well in year 12. And I said to them, I'm going to prove them wrong. And I will go to uni and I will go to law school of all degrees, which is probably one of the toughest you can complete. And I did. And I finished 3 degrees, including a master's in law.
So while you were doing law, you did an elective on international humanitarian law. What did you learn about the wars you'd lived through on the outside?
It was really quite confronting. I mean, I didn't even know that there was such thing as the siege of Sarajevo, that it was, one of the longest sieges in the history, over 3 years. I didn't know that the massacre of those men and boys in Srebrenica was actually a genocide. It was really quite interesting to see my country projected up on the screen. A few times I had to leave the lecture theatre in case I recognized somebody exhumed from the mass graves, like my own family members or neighbours. And it was really quite confronting to have your own country treated as like this guinea pig, to be pulled apart by these very smart law students. And one of them actually ended up going to Geneva, to the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia. And she represented Ratko Mladic, who's one of the indicted war criminals. He's currently serving his life sentence. When you are, a young sort of law student or about to become a lawyer, you can't really choose who you do have a choice who you represent, but this was a good experience for her. She felt that she could learn a lot in terms of international human rights law and international criminal law by representing him. And he ended up actually writing this letter in Cyrillic and gave it to her. And she brought it all the way to Adelaide and asked me to read it. And it was this letter that was from a war criminal, somebody who committed the biggest genocide since World War II. And his handwriting was this quite neat Cyrillic on-line paper, the same sort of handwriting that issued the order to murder all those men and boys. And she brought it all the way to this quiet lecture theatre in Adelaide. So it was really quite interesting. It felt like I couldn't escape this war. It was like a sticky second skin that was always stuck to me.
So, Daniel, looking back now, it seems all your life you've been straddling borders, not seen as being fully Serb, not seen as being fully Croat, held really strongly by your mum and your siblings in your immediate family, not so much by some members of the extended family. A few years ago, you came out to your family as gay, and last year you were named the inaugural winner of the Les Murray Award for Refugee Recognition. It seems so much of your life is about this tension between belonging and not belonging, who's in and who's out. What do you think about this vexed question of identity and belonging?
Yeah, I think, some identities are inerasable. You can't sort of dim them or erase them. So like your sexuality or your skin color. But identities are not always fixed, and not always necessarily the ones you are given to you at birth. I never thought that I would be an Australian. I never thought that I'd be a refugee. And also, I've seen how identities can lead to conflict. I've seen how fissuring and siloing into identities can lead to an entire state breakdown and a civil war. I don't think identity is a static kind of experience. Identities change and evolve. You look at the expansive gender identities we have, and I think it's identity, for me at least, is a lot broader than just being a member of the LGBTIQ community or from culturally and linguistically diverse background or a refugee. It's also my interests, the workplace that I work for, my hobbies. So I like to think of identity in terms of, values and aspirations that we all share and that transcend things like gender and skin and sexuality and class. It's healthier for a democracy and a country to have a more capacious sense of identity. You can find a home in something that is a lot more bigger and can look after those identities, so we don't have to feel that we need to go into these sharp divisions that can result in something like what happened to me, where you have your own family members fighting in a most visceral way. I worried that sometimes identity or claiming identity very sharply can lead to conflict.
How about your mum? Your mum was a woman who completely disregarded all those rules about picking a side for love, really. Is she a model in the way you think about these things?
Yeah, I think so. She's somebody that really, I guess, has strong values and strong principles about treating people with decency and respect regardless of who they are. And she's really instilled this in us. My twin brother is married to a practicing Bosnian Muslim woman, just like my mom was married to an Orthodox Serb man. And so she never saw those sharp ethnic divisions. She was always speaking about values and principles that we share rather than identities.
Danijel, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been lovely speaking with you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Richard. Yeah, it was great.
Danijel Malbasa is the inaugural winner of the Les Murray Award for Refugee Recognition. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
Earshot is back with a new season called Follow Me. Meet a doomsday cult leader.
When these chastisements happened, hell would be opened and all the devils would walk the earth.
I mean, loving The Cure now,
Die-hard music fans.
at the tender age of 52.
And a mother trying to keep her daughter safe and sane online.
Restricting and banning just hasn't worked.
Come follow Earshot on the ABC Listen app.
What path can I follow to not feel this anymore?